All right, it is 6:30 p.m. on Wednesday, September 1st. I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting to order, and we'll start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. While the board is not required to hear comments, but chooses to allow the public a chance to address the board only during the public comment segment of this meeting, individual speakers are asked to limit their comments to not more than 2 minutes. The remainder of the meeting is designated for the board to conduct business before them without interruption or unsolicited feedback. The board asks that all comments be civil, courteous, and respectful. And I do not believe that as of tonight that we have any visitors with us here in the media center. Individuals that are viewing a live stream and recording of this meeting may direct their comments to questions@isd2342.org. Our mission statement is to challenge and support our student, staff, and families in each person's growth as an engaged learner and successful citizen of our community. I'll move into roll call, starting with Christensen.
Here.
Gross.
Here.
Nessman is here. Sabalik.
Here.
Sandstead.
Here.
Strunk.
Here.
And Ulrich. Okay. Moving into our agenda, we do have a couple of modifications under the consent agenda. We're going to add C3, accept the resignation of elementary school paraprofessional Samantha Hilbrand. C4, accept the resignation of secondary custodian Aaliyah Garza, with her last workday being September 13th. C5, approve the hiring of Alexis, I may not pronounce this correctly, Hagrefe, as a full-time paraprofessional at North Elementary at step 1. C6, approve the hiring of Carissa Green as a full-time paraprofessional at secondary at step 2. And that moves what was previously 3 and 4 to number 7 and 8. Any other modifications to tonight's agenda? Seeing as none, I'll ask for a motion to adopt the modified agenda.
So moved. Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, the same sign. Motion passes. Moving into our consent agenda, I'll review these items one more time, ask if there's any questions or comments from the board. Number 1, accept the resignation of secondary paraprofessional Lisa Hansen. Number 2, accept the resignation of elementary paraprofessional Megan Andreessen. Number 3, accept the resignation of elementary school paraprofessional Samantha Hilbrand. Number 4, accept the resignation of secondary custodian Aaliyah Garza, with their last workday being September 13th. Number 5, approve the hiring of Alexis Hagrefe as a full-time paraprofessional at North Elementary at step 1. Number 6, approve the hiring of Carissa Green as a full-time paraprofessional at secondary at step 2. Number 7, approve the lane change from BA plus 20 to MA for Courtney Pekowski. And number 8, approve the dairy bid for FY22. Any questions or comments from the board for Superintendent Hoagie? Okay. Seeing as none, I'll ask for a motion to approve the consent agenda as read.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, the same sign. Motion passes. Moving to old business. Number 1, consider and approve the revised safe return to in-person learning plan. Mr. Hoagie, would you like to elaborate for the board?
Sure. When that was submitted to you for consideration at our last meeting, it was a document that was prepared by our attorney. After a review by the property owner's attorney, he had some suggestions for change, and I sent that document to you with some corrections in red. And
Mr. Hoagie, do you want to back up to the safe return to in-person learning?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. My mistake. I still provided a document to you, and it had red highlights. So there we go. So after this was submitted, we had a few people make comments to us and communications, and then after reading it and going through with administrators, we thought there should be some other clarification. So the changes here are in red. So we talk about social distancing and with social distancing on busing. It seemed to be a little too liberal to say there will be no restriction on school transportation. There will be no distance and seating restriction, which means that they'll fill all the seats on the bus. Last year we had to alternate seats and didn't fill into capacity. So that's the one change that's been made there. And then with the quarantine, there was a comment made to me following the meeting, and when we talk about students and staff who are vaccinated, we also should all include in there, because the CDC does, and also the Department of Health, that fully recovered people from COVID-19 also have the same, or in the same situation as those who are fully vaccinated. And then those individuals would not need to quarantine also. Now, there's been some concerns expressed. I think they went to some of you as board members, or maybe all of you got the letter now, about how when we do this, we're showing favoritism to those that are vaccinated, and they may be especially privileged because they are. Well, the statement that I haven't read is a statement that comes directly from CDC, July 29th, 2021, which is the most recent update. And they state very specifically that if a person does not have symptoms and they've been vaccinated, that they do not need to go through the quarantine process. And it also includes the people that have also had COVID, had tested positive, and no longer have symptoms. So this is a concern within a portion of our community members. There are individuals that think that we should just go with the standard 10 or 14-day quarantine. So there's a consistency all across the board. For those people that can and have had the vaccine, it certainly puts them in a position in which now those people be penalized by needing the longer requirement that the CDC doesn't require. So, as you consider this portion of the return to safe learning, I think it warrants some discussion on where you sit as board members.
So will fully recovered from COVID have the same, so if somebody's vaccinated, they have to show that they've been fully vaccinated. And so if somebody has COVID, they have to show that a positive test for them?
I think that would be a determination that's made administratively, that they no longer have symptoms that are keeping them away from work, away from school, that they don't have fever. So
But am I reading this, then maybe I'm reading this wrong. So if somebody had COVID last year.
Yep.
Do they not have to quarantine?
Well, they have to quarantine the same as a vaccinated person
If they-
based on this, right?
Okay, so if that's the case, do they have to bring in a thing from the doctor that says they were positive?
Like, when you think about this, if we're asking for proof of vaccination in order to have the shortened quarantine period, I don't know how it'd be any different, but then we're going to have those who are going to say, I had it, but I didn't go in. So
There's where we're at.
that's why I'm saying is this is going to put us in like
Because-
different buckets, and how is that going to be handled? Like, I
Well,
can see where what you're saying too.
That's the question, because there's people out there that are getting vaccinated and for the reason that they don't have to quarantine.
Well, they have to quarantine just for 4 days less.
No, if they've been vaccinated, they don't have to quarantine at all, as long as they don't have any
If you
symptoms.
don't have any symptoms, you don't have to quarantine at all if you've been vaccinated.
Oh, did that
Second.
change?
Red second.
It's been that way for a little while.
It wasn't a part of the return to school plan until this language was presented
Oh, I
tonight.
maybe missed. I guess I didn't even realize this.
They have to mask. They don't have symptoms. That's the part.
That part is, this
That's
stuff
our-
right here is not in our thing right now, right?
Recommendation that they should wear the mask, and they wear the mask because there are people who have been vaccinated that when exposed contract COVID again, even though they've been vaccinated.
So what were we talking about last time when there was a 10-day quarantine period and a 14? This is where I'm getting confused because I thought it,
They,
If you have a
I had the-
positive test.
If you've been vaccinated
Yeah, if-
and you test positive, your quarantine is 10 days.
oh, so it's not the contact issue. Okay, so then maybe I need to back up here.
If
14 days for those that
14
don't
days,
have, that are close contact, and 10 for those that actually have it. And it's 10 from when the day that you're.
Positive test, you have a 10-day quarantine period.
If you're vaccinated.
Time that you're,
Even if you're not vaccinated, if you have a positive test, you have a 10-day quarantine
Okay.
period. If you don't have a test or you have a negative test, you have a 14-day quarantine period. So you actually have longer
and get
if you're
tested.
negative than if you're positive.
That's crazy.
So if you're on if you don't have it, if you're a close contact and you don't have any symptoms and you want to shorten your quarantine from 14 to 10, you can go in after the 7th day, get a test. If that test is negative, then your quarantine period is only 10 days. The kicker is it has to be a certain test. It can't be in the rapid test. It has to be the PCR test, which ends up lasting 3 days pretty much, 2 for sure, and maybe 3. So then you're at 10 days anyway.
Are people gonna go and get tested specifically just to get a shorter quarantine period?
I think you have people on every side of the fence, what vaccinated, not vaccinated.
That isn't-
Be a test, not test.
If it's,
My question is if,
I mean, being in there on Wednesday and playing a football game on Friday, you probably,
Yes. Yep.
That's where you're gonna have those
If it's missing,
situations.
if it's missing a test. that you
then
don't
they'll
wanna
probably take the 14,
you go
right?
The other way, right?
At one point,
my question, was- back to my question is the fact that if there's a child in the school and they were a close contact, in order for them to not have to quarantine, they have to show proof of their vaccination.
Or proof of,
We can get access.
That's where we're getting into, or proof of a positive test.
right,
Is that what this is saying?
that's what Darren was trying to clarify. When you say
Can they
covered,
say, well, I was positive, but I didn't get tested? That's my question on the whole thing.
I think
I know exactly what you're asking.
consistency and for verification, we need to have a physician statement indicating that the person had tested positive previously. Otherwise, an individual could just say, well, I had it and I didn't go in.
They're positive.
Right, well, like I said, if we're requesting somebody who's vaccinated to provide proof of vaccination in order to qualify for the shorter period, then it only make sense that it's the same, right, is what you're saying?
Mhm.
Because otherwise people could just say that they had it and then
And
they're being held at a different standard than the people who have been vaccinated then.
through a statewide database, we will have access to the individuals who have been vaccinated. So our school nurse will be able to access that information.
for those that have recovered from COVID-19, do we have any sort of sense of the surrounding districts? And I guess my second part of that question would be, is it any different privacy data? You know, it's been clearly communicated that vaccinations are not, what's the appropriate way to say
Well,
this?
they're not protected.
They're not protected
You're right.
information based off of HIPAA, like something else, but a disease process is recovery from COVID-19 protected by, is that different?
But nobody needs to know that other than the person that they show that verification
And it's
to.
a choice to show
It's a
that
choice that-
So
information.
you would choose to give that information, but people in the public won't know because if you're vaccinated, which is public data, so I mean, for what anybody knows, they could have been vaccinated. If we see that individual is not quarantined, then we can make the assumption that they've previously tested positive, but we're not going out to get that information. That's being provided to us, and then we will not be imposing a quarantine.
Other than that, then if no information is provided, everyone is treated the same way,
They are.
right?
Say that again?
If
So
you
if I-
choose not to share any
So if I'm a close
information,
contact, is that what we're saying? If I'm a close contact and I choose not to share information, or is this only if I test positive?
no, I'm talking about if you choose not to share that you have fully recovered from COVID by choice, then everyone's treated the same way. If you choose not to share that you've been vaccinated, then everyone's treated the same way. I just wanted to clarify that if someone chooses not to share information, there's no requirement to share that information, in which
Mhm.
case everyone would be treated the same way.
Right.
But it should say that in here. It does say that you have to prove that you're,
Well, we'd have to write the same thing in there for the fact that it says staff who are fully vaccinated, because if we're gonna, you know what I'm saying?
it says you can reduce your quarantine by, it
Students-
says somewhere in here that you're required to show that you've been vaccinated. It says proof of vaccination will be required for a shortened quarantine period. So it should say the same thing.
You're looking at
Say the same
The
thing.
vaccinations.
Under vaccinations, the last line.
Team, sorry.
It doesn't have to say it under vaccinations, obviously, because it's not that thing, but it should say it under the quarantine someplace.
I can add a comment that there had to be proof that they had,
I think you just add it, both sides of it, to that students and staff who are fully vaccinated or fully recovered from COVID need to provide in that section too. And so that way it's redundant, but at least it's saying the same thing.
Well, it just needs to be fair to everybody. I mean, it has to be.
I can adjust that so we get medical verification.
Does it describe what contact is? What is close contact? So everybody understands that. After contact,
Up
close
there it
contact.
says more than 15 minutes within 6 feet for.
Where are you at?
In a 24-hour period.
The red.
Someplace on there.
Red paragraph down on the second page.
Oh,
Right
that we
there.
don't have that on what we
On
have.
That was my,
I had another question about what are the different quarantine periods?
there's none. There's 10, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to understand
14.
still too. Now that,
But isn't there like a 3 or a 4 now too?
There was a 7 under certain circumstances, but we never saw any way that that would apply to us in the school district last spring.
Because that's the other place it says the length of quarantine periods resulting from close contact will depend on the nature of the exposure, whether the person was and then there's a comment that says whether the person was vaccinated and is without symptoms. So what are the specifics about what identifies your quarantine period is what? Within 6 feet for 15 minutes? And then,
Not vaccinated.
and then after that, it's 10 days for sure, unless you're vaccinated or have had COVID, is that?
If I understand right,
Correct.
if you're vaccinated and you don't have.
There's no 3 or 4 or test out or anything like that?
No.
Okay. I just want to know what exactly defines each thing so that everybody knows what they're getting into.
well, and I think that's something that we should maybe, since obviously some of us were unclear about that. I was, now, I guess I didn't realize there was the 0. I thought we were talking in 10 and 14, so I needed to back up again.
So yeah, paragraph 2 should say close contact, right? The red one, because close contact is when they would qualify. People who've not been fully vaccinated need not quarantine after contact, but it's really close contact is what we're saying, right?
Is that
Just so it's
the red
consistent.
stuff directly from CDC or is?
Red stuff under where it says CDC update, the 2 red paragraphs.
Or
The CDC.
They aren't part of our plan yet.
That's not very clear. That's right from them.
I think, yeah, are we up?
Talk about close contact and
Well, I think it's all based on close contact, right? I mean, if I just brush against you and we move on our way, that doesn't
That's one
count.
thing.
or if we sit
Right.
together, you know,
Right.
we'd be in trouble, but everybody there would be
Right, they would be
fine
fine.
if you had it, right? So, but that's not real clear, right?
If Maya tests positive, then the 2 of you would be considered close contact, right?
Unless I got up every 15 minutes and moved.
No, it's
No, it's cumulative.
in
The total.
24 hours.
You
So
have to get up and.
do you want me to sit over there?
Okay, okay.
So then in that circumstance, someone who's vaccinated and doesn't have any symptoms doesn't have to quarantine.
Correct.
If they show their vaccination status, if they choose to not,
If you would say, I've been vaccinated and the school nurse then checks the statewide database and sees that, yes, you're vaccinated on a specific date, then you'd be free to not quarantine.
and then if we hadn't been vaccinated or didn't have proof of, we'd have to quarantine for
14 days.
14 days.
14 days.
Unless you
If it's a
test positive.
family member, if it's a family member, it could end up to be 24 days
I know that.
Or longer,
or longer.
because it's 10 days or 14 days after that person last has symptoms. So if you're in the same.
They're 14.
First,
Their day 1 starts after the 10 days of the
right.
quarantine.
But if you're in the same family, Kayla could get it after you. Terry's still free to go. But then Terry's got to wait until the last day of Kayla's symptoms in her quarantine.
That's the dilemma, because it can be up to, like you said, 24 days or longer.
My kids are.
So if you're in a family, you are more fortunate if you
All test.
test positive immediately.
Mhm.
Do we know how many kids are in the ICU? How big? I mean, it just seems insane to me that we're doing this again. I think we should.
I don't know how many in ICU, but the number of students who are now positive has been increasing in the state of Minnesota.
Yeah, but they're not at risk. They recover fully. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a better chance of getting killed by lightning. You know,
Mhm.
this is, we're spending so much energy on, we should be teaching them how to be young adults and productive
Yeah.
community citizens. So we could choose to disregard this, I suppose, if we wanted to as a board. What do we know that other districts are doing? Alec is fully masked, right?
K6, they're masked.
Yeah, and so the 6th to 8th graders are together and the 6th graders are masked and the 7th and 8th aren't.
They're not.
And they came out with the plan and changed it within a week and a half.
I don't know where it's at
Because I think
now.
their first plan said that they weren't gonna do masks, and they also, as far as quarantine, they were gonna do nothing. It was gonna be.
Yeah.
I read it and I was like, I'm just trying to understand how we can, have this and everyone's all over the place, and I don't know how you.
Control. That's a good thing.
Agree and disagree all at the same time.
Right.
I guess
We have the decision.
probably, I don't know. Would it be our opinion that most of our kids have had it already? I think a lot of them have been exposed. Hopefully this isn't a big issue. Hopefully none of them get it, but maybe they will. I don't know. What's our gut on that?
I don't know that it's a big issue. Like I said, who knows how it's going to impact us, but we have to have something in place because
Right.
we just have to decide,
It can't be stupid, difficult and restrictive, and it's gotta be practical.
Oh, we spent a whole year with fully masked and half of it distance learning. So
Mhm.
We're better than
at
that
least we're
for now.
here in person 5 days a week, and masks are optional, but
Mhm.
let's start. And who knows, in a week, it might all go out the window and.
I guess, and, I realize how sensitive of a subject this is, but I think maybe down the vein, Gary, of what you were talking about, where I struggle a little bit as our kiddos that are not symptomatic, that are held to the 14-day quarantine. That's where I struggle the most. I think, what's the incubation period now? They say that you're symptomatic within how many days? And
Well, the Delta variant's within like just a couple days, supposedly.
so the question is, do you be conservative and do you follow CDC guidelines and MDH, which of course have certainly sparked a lot of controversial discussion about what personal beliefs are, right? Or do we look at the data and do we say, statistically, we know that this is affect significantly the elderly. It can affect adults that have pre-existing conditions. There are kiddos that this could affect if they have pre-existing conditions. There's not a clear-cut answer. I guess one of my questions would be, I know when this first came up, Mr. Hoagie, you had kind of alluded to maybe some liability or risk that the district runs.
If the CDC or the Minnesota Department of Health have issue a requirement and you fail, or if we fail to do that, there'd definitely be a legal liability. Vaccinations, if you would decide that you want individuals, employees to have a vaccination when the state doesn't require that, if there's a medical situation that occurs with that staff member or student, then you could be liable. So when it's a recommendation, and I had shared this with another person that I was asked, why am I not following the recommendation of the CDC and requiring masks? And my statement is, well, I am, and we are recommending exactly the same that CDC does. It's a family decision, or even within a family, there may be decisions that are contrary to different family members. If a child has a pre-existing condition and they're concerned about the vaccination, they may choose not to do that. I think some of that concern for the vaccination may be alleviated now with the Pfizer vaccine being fully FDA approved. That may change.
So are the quarantine time, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Are the quarantine periods requirements or recommendations?
Well, quarantine if you have been in close contact. It says you quarantine if you have been in close contact within 6 feet and 15 minutes for a 24-hour period. And then it goes on to say that people who've been vaccinated do not need to be. So my presumption by reading that is that quarantine is a requirement.
I think that's what we're trying to gather is when we talk about masks, it says recommended. We know that, right? Which is why we said it was.
Federal level for sure.
Huh?
On the federal level for sure, it's a requirement. Because the federal, I want to understand the federal government has given the CDC the authority to determine quarantine periods.
Okay, that's,
State
we're
level.
talking about quarantines. I was like,
We
wait
were
a
talking about
second.
masks.
I was talking about masks and I was like, what? Okay, so
State level, that there's an argument to be made there because
you're saying this federal is telling the state that they have the,
the federal has their, it's no different than, some of the other federal laws that are out there. Where a state says it's okay.
Right now, masks are
Not,
required
right?
in federal buildings.
Right, and that's why masks are.
They are.
That's why masks are required on the buses because it's federal.
Public transportation. I guess, and this is the difficult part, it has nothing to do with what my personal viewpoints are or aren't, but I think a requirement to me, when we look at liability as a school district and minimizing risk, I personally feel an obligation to stick to requirements and leave recommendations as recommendations. That's my thoughts.
and I think that we're all trying to grasp what pieces of this exactly are required and what, what are recommendations and what are requirements.
This is an email response that I received yesterday. I had sent a question to Horizon Public Health. And my question was, what are the most recent statements from CDC and MDH regarding quarantine periods? Previously, you shared with me that those who are vaccinated do not need to quarantine. What about others? So the response is this. If you are vaccinated and you've been exposed to someone who tests positive for COVID-19, you should get tested 3 to 5 days after the exposure, even if you don't have symptoms. In addition, to protect others, wear a mask in public for 14 days following exposure unless you get a negative test result. You need to isolate for 10 days if your test result is positive or if you are developing symptoms. The quarantine guidance has not changed if you are unvaccinated. You need to quarantine immediately and after determining that you had an exposure to a positive case for more than 15 minutes, 24-hour period, and closer than 6 feet. You need to get tested in 3 to 5 days. So, the word that comes from Horizon Public Health is you need
Okay, I just,
quarantine.
one question, just because I got the you need to quarantine, but then it says you need to test. I didn't.
it says you should, and should and shall are two very
Oh,
important.
didn't you say need twice? You said need, it said need to test in 3 to 5.
Should.
It does say you need to get tested in 3 to 5 days if you get a negative. And if you get a negative result and are not having symptoms, you can be released from quarantine.
So that, I guess, my question is
So there
that wording is.
need again.
Yeah, and does,
But
so
that's
which
not
one's
the
right?
same as-
Beginning, you said that if
This is
Uh,
Horizon.
there's a vaccinated, well, unless we're talking about an unvaccinated, a vaccinated person should get tested after 3
Should.
days. Should. That doesn't mean you have to. That's a
But
recommendation.
at the bottom, he said need and need. That's why my question was, is where's the wording coming from? And
But you're right, Darren. If you are vaccinated, it says you should get tested in 3 to 5 days.
yeah, well, there's no requirement on testing. So that's where I get that part of it. But I guess that would be the unvaccinated. Where it said need and need, that makes me question the first need. Because they can't tell us we need to get back, we can't tell us we need to get tested. But if it says they need, you know what I mean? Those 2 needs in a row, it makes me question which one of those is correct. Because I can't imagine both of them is. If either, that'd be my question.
Yeah, if Maya has COVID, Sarah with him, and we both had COVID, and so we have positive antibodies, we said blood test. We wear a mask back to school. She has a volleyball game that Friday night. She's got to wear a mask. I got to wear a mask for 14 days, right? Mask indoors, in public. So maybe not. So volleyball, yes. Football, no.
Fully vaccinated do not need to quarantine after contact unless they have symptoms. However, fully
Sort of gets crazy.
fully vaccinated people should get tested. Yep, should. Even if they don't have symptoms.
And wear a mask indoors.
Feel like we're doing that team.
That's not a requirement. That would be a recommendation.
And so
Go back, should wear a mask indoors.
on the
But, yeah,
MDH
that's not-
website, it just says the title is how long to keep away from others, your quarantine period. If you are not fully vaccinated and have close contact with someone, the safest option is to stay home and away from others for 14 days. So it does say, please note that the below recommendations are not universal. Some settings and workplaces like healthcare have different rules about quarantine. So I don't know if the quarantine is an actual requirement. The way this is worded, it's more recommendations.
So here, there's a science brief from the CDC, and it says the CDC recommends a quarantine period of 14 days. That was December 2nd, 2020. I'm sure there's something newer than that. Is when did the Delta variant?
July 29th,
Yeah.
2021.
A month ago.
Right. The struggle that I have here is it starts the sentence not with should or must. It just,
Says quarantine.
right. So it's not a clarification from prior CDC
Deal. That
releases.
clip you have on there from the CDC, did you just put that piece of it or is there more to it? Do you remember?
I think that's a portion of a lengthy document that I pulled a portion that referred to quarantine.
That is exactly how it's worded here
Mhm.
on the website that I'm looking at, which
What's the
is
date that you have
CDC.
there?
July 29th.
So is that the start of it?
2021. Yep. Quarantine if you have been in close contact within 6 feet of someone for a cumulative total of 15 minutes or more over a 24-hour period with someone who has COVID-19 unless you have been fully vaccinated. People who are fully vaccinated do not need to quarantine after contact with someone who had COVID-19 unless they have symptoms. However, fully vaccinated people should get tested 3 to 5 days after their exposure, even if they don't have symptoms, and wear a mask indoors in public for 14 days following exposure or until their test result is negative. It says what to do. Stay home for 14 days after your last contact with a person who has COVID-19. Watch for fever, cough, shortness of breath, or other symptoms of COVID-19. If possible, stay away from people you live with, especially people who are at higher risk for getting very sick from COVID-19. It says you may be able to shorten your quarantine. Your local public health authorities make the final decision about how long quarantine should last based on local conditions and needs. Follow the recommendations of your local public health department if you need to quarantine. Options they will consider include stopping quarantine after day 10 without testing, or after day 7 after receiving a negative test result, and the test must occur on day 5 or later.
It's day 5.
It says 3 to 5 here, though. So there's so much misinformation.
Mhm.
Does that ever define quarantine? Quarantine is what?
Oh, as should or need?
No, as what it is. Is it 10 days or 14 days or 7 days? Is it, didn't, I never.
Oh, yeah,
heard-
it said
Depends.
depends. Yeah.
Watch for symptoms until
Is it
14 days
safer?
after exposure. That says after quarantine.
What is quarantine? Yeah.
Under the quarantine section, it says what to do. Stay home for 14 days after your last contact with a person who has COVID-19. And then down below, it talks about you may be able to shorten quarantine period, and it gives that criteria.
Right here,
1075 or.
recommended for people.
1210 is what it's got listed here.
That's 813.
Yep. So if you do the math, after day 7, after receiving a negative test result, and the test must occur on day 5 or later, that's 12 days,
14, 12 if you decided to take a test.
which is
10 if you, what was the 10?
without testing. So it's, you have,
Said you could end your quarantine on day 7 if you took a test on day 5, or
After day 5, yeah.
not day 7 after the test, day 7 of your quarantine.
after day 7, after receiving a negative test result. That's correct.
Right.
And the test must be on day 5 or later.
Right.
So after 10 days without testing. So according, and this is the July 29th release, I mean, these quarantine times are 10 and 7, and we've got 14 and 10 in there, correct?
That's updated September 1. Does that make it any, is there any more clear
Oh,
things in there?
goodness.
I got one from 813 that just says quarantine is recommended for people who have been in close contact.
Is that CDC? or MDH?
So here's a different question then. I mean, we're talking about all this, because this is the one that's gonna come up probably most for us. Does the Minnesota State High School League have requirements?
I haven't seen anything from high school league.
Because that's, I
Really to quarantine.
mean, that's gonna be the one that,
Right, that'll be the most.
I assume, isn't that just gonna follow
Right.
MDH?
I don't know. I'm
MDH
just
is
saying.
telling us you gotta create your own plan?
So what I'm saying is,
It's not
if we
following
just
CDC.
decide that, hey, there's no quarantine at West Central area because it's a recommendation, just like we're not gonna require masks because it's a recommendation. Does that affect, how does that affect as far as eligibility wise?
MSHSL, this is releases from 8/13. And
I mean, last year, didn't it follow whatever Minnesota?
Right, but we also required masks for everyone too.
Well, and it was
We did all
also a
those things,
mandate
yeah.
last year. And
We
we
didn't
Right,
play
it was-
sports,
it was
we
a
didn't
mandate.
do play, and we didn't,
So,
masked on the basketball. court.
Maintain
It was a whole different year.
so cohorts and
Right.
pods, screening,
That sounds a lot like last year's, that stuff. Cohorts and pods.
this is 2021, 2022. Records should be kept. of
there was pods in the 2021 too. It just didn't ever come up because nobody talked about it because we didn't do anything.
Right.
We canceled everything.
Mhm,
Said
right.
pods in there.
Right.
Athletic programs should follow their school's identified protocols for student athletes or coaches who have tested positive or experienced symptoms consistent with COVID-19 diagnosis. It is recommended that fully vaccinated people who have a known exposure to someone with suspected or confirmed COVID be tested 3 to 5 days after the exposure, regardless of whether they have symptoms. People who test positive for COVID-19 should stay at home until all 3 of these things are true. They feel better, their cough, shortness of breath, or other symptoms are better. It has been at least 10 days since they first experienced symptoms. They have had no fever for at least 24 hours. I'm not seeing any quarantine
There's sports and other curricular activities there.
requirements or recommendations other than to follow our school approved protocols.
I have one question. We've talked about this right away about, we've said, as far as quarantine goes, is that we wouldn't, there's not like a local, like, do you have whatever we called that last year, that team here that did all the contact
Command
tracing?
team?
Yeah, that's not happening here anymore?
That's
It'll
what
happen.
that document is that you saw at our last meeting.
Hmm.
That was put together by them. Or primarily by me and then confirmed by them.
Which document?
The return to schools.
The return to school plan?
Yep.
But my question is, as far as quarantine goes, is that going to be managed by public health, or is that going to be managed by us? Because I'm just wondering, if we're not doing the contact tracing, then do we make these rules or does public health? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Didn't we talk about, like,
So I have the CDC document up there right now. And the first paragraph reads, schools should continue to collaborate with state and local health departments just to the extent allowable by privacy laws. So Kayla, you read something with Minnesota Department of Health that said should or recommend.
It's a recommendation.
Recommendation.
Quarantine is recommended
Okay, so
from the state.
So I got the email from Horizon Public Health that indicates that they need to quarantine immediately, and I got that yesterday. When you look at bullet number 2 here, CDC document, it says close contacts who are not fully vaccinated should be referred for testing. Regardless of the test result, they should quarantine at home for 14 days.
So to complicate this even more, I mean, there's high risk and low risk. Obviously, if, let's say, my oldest gets it, then we should all quarantine. But I don't, because, so at work, for example, if there's a lot of my staff had close contact, but the Department of Health said that if it's not somebody living in the house with them, they don't need to quarantine. So, or the quarantine, you can look at it a little bit differently. So I mean, it'd be one thing if it was a household exposure versus just walking by in the hallway. If we wanted to look at it that way.
There are so many different ways to slice this apple, but to Gary's point, I think, where I feel obligation, a parent has called in and communicated that their child is tested positive. I feel an obligation to communicate with families whose children were in close contact. That's where I feel obligated. Requiring or not requiring quarantine time, that's where I'm struggling. Because a lot of the language that we're coming back to is saying should. And
Do we have any data at all from the school standpoint of during last year's school time of the kids that were quarantined due to close contact?
One.
How many?
It's one.
Maybe.
Things were completely different last year. We masked,
Yeah, that,
so we were really successful on not having COVID spread within our activities and our classrooms. But the big change there was masking. The big change for us with people, children that are 12 and older, is now they can be vaccinated. And I don't have any idea what percentage of our students 12 to 17 are vaccinated, or 12 to 18 are vaccinated.
so let's say that we had somebody who, like you said, we let the parents know they were in close contact. Someone doesn't quarantine, ends up getting it, chooses to not quarantine. Are we getting any liability situation if that person then?
I think so.
I'm just asking. I don't know that, because if everything's recommended, where's the liability?
A lot of our discussions have been obviously COVID related, right? But if we look at the broader picture, what's a realistic expectation for a school district with parents?
Right.
If your children is symptomatic, they should stay
Stay
home.
home.
If they've got a runny nose, if they've got a cough, if they've got a fever, that's right. Whether it's
48 hours,
flu,
stay
it's
home.
COVID, it's the stomach bug, whatever. That I know with absolute certainty, it shouldn't be much of a debate around if your child is symptomatic. A requirement to communicate, as I indicated a few minutes ago, your child was in close contact with another child that has COVID. So then that parent is aware, and we go back to, are they symptomatic? Okay, then that parent has an obligation to keep their kid home, because that's our policy regardless of what you have. Are they
But
asymptomatic?
that's only 48 hours. I mean, if you talk about the policy, 48 hours, right?
Right,
48,
for the flu.
I'm saying if you're, I'm just saying, are you
You
saying
have to
this
be
as a flu?
you have to be non-symptomatic for 48 hours
hours.
before you come back.
No fever.
particularly
Well,
fever.
so that's what I'm saying, is you're saying set this aside and treat this as if we would for a flu. Is that what you're saying in this example?
So the question is, do we continue to treat this isolated just as COVID, or do we go back to if we're shifting where we're not 6 feet apart anymore, we're 3 feet apart, we're trying to make steps to get life back to normal. How much back to normal do we as a district want to, where do we draw that line? We're saying we're not going to be 6 feet apart, we're going to be 3 feet apart, but we're still going to do the quarantine times? I don't know. Or do we focus on what's the bigger, broader picture? If your child has symptoms, no matter what those symptoms are, and whether it's COVID, it's flu, it's stomach bug, it's whatever, parents have a responsibility to keep their kids at home. Isolation and quarantine, because a lot of the language is should, do we give parents the choice of, you can isolate your asymptomatic child to be safe, whether that's because you choose to, just concern of COVID, or you choose to because they've got pre-existing or what have you. If they're symptomatic, then here's the expectation. They need to be asymptomatic for at least 48 hours before they come back, or show proof of a negative test, and we can weave things in there. It's a significant change from what we're doing here.
I guess so then if you're going to do it, so then are you still going to require a positive COVID test?
You can if you're going to treat it like any
I
other.
would eliminate everything.
No, I'm saying if I test positive, are you going to require me to stay home for 10 days?
Yes.
So then if you have symptoms, then you should still stay home for 10 days. days if you want to get tested or not. You know, if you're going to do it that way. Because if you're saying that you didn't get tested and you got the sniffles
I got
and
the flu and you have
I
COVID.
got tested and I got positive test,
I just have
and
a
we have the
cold.
exact same symptoms, but you can go back when you feel better and I have to stay 10 days. Well, you
So we're
know,
in the same situation on that
what-
then.
here we are again. So I guess my question for you would be, is if we're gonna go back and treat it like a regular cold, what's the number where we come back and say, wait a minute, we probably better go back to some guidelines? That's what I'm curious
get what
about.
you're
I was listening to Michelle and talk about notification. I see that we notify that first tier. So if I've tested positive and we call your parents and tell your parents that you were exposed at school and you decide that, well, there's no symptoms, I'm going back. You're asymptomatic and you feel fine, but now Kayla tests positive a few days later. But we never called Kayla's parents because she wasn't in close contact with me. She was in close contact with the asymptomatic Terry. So, this is a lot of speculation. What may happen? And I think Gary mentioned it earlier, is how much care do we take for something that
May not.
may or may not happen? And Maya just kind of followed it up. Do we relax things more at WCA until we would see some type of an issue arise and then we become more diligent about quarantining? Do we perhaps consider masking at that time? I think we need to get to be extreme before we go to that level, but
Last year we had if it's this number to this number in the county, we're gonna change, then we have to start, so what is
What is that? And then we
I mean, if we're
decide
gonna do
that.
it this way, then what's our number here in our school before we say,
We gotta do
uh-oh,
something different.
we got a problem?
How many positive reported COVID cases did we deal with last year?
What do you mean that were actually in the school?
Chrissy, do you have an idea of how many positive cases we had throughout the year?
Ballpark, out of 1,000 or 800 kids.
Veterans Day was our highest quarantine at like 111. And that still is only 1 or 2 positives. And that's only had 3 positives. It wasn't until the very end of the school year that I think we had.
That number of positive cases was really small compared to the number of people that were quarantined during the course of the year.
And I think I am very concerned about, I know it's a significant increase in the amount of work for our teachers with distance learning, but distance learning being taken away, I am concerned about the number of kiddos that 10 to 14 days has the potential to significantly put them behind academically with not the same kind of support that they received last year.
They're gonna be absent for those days and doing makeup homework and not be in the classroom learning. That's gonna be different than last year when they actually were sort of connected.
Yeah.
Can we get the number of, can we find the number of kids that we quarantined last year? I mean, obviously we had distance learning available, so they got some form of education, but how many kids actually quarantined? If we only had one possibly that came positive out of all the quarantines, then that tells us how many kids sat at home really for nothing and lost out on education, right?
Well, I think, didn't we find out the majority of our quarantines were the bus related situations? And
Right.
as far as we know, there was absolutely no transmission in that situation.
So we get back to the risk is
The risk, is
extremely
it-
low.
And even like you look at so Damon tested positive in May.
Mhm.
Damon, Owen and Piper together for all that quarantine, and Owen and Piper never tested positive.
And they were out for how many days?
And they were quarantined for 20 days because of it.
Well, we had a kid on the football team that was out for 60
I was
days
gonna say the whole season.
because his family tested positive. He never got it,
Never tested positive. Yeah.
you know? So not that football is the most important thing, but that's 60 days he didn't get to come to school.
School, exactly.
You know?
Mhm.
We just know he was out that long because it happened to be, you know, reported in our sports thing, but the kid was out of school for 60 days for nothing. And you look at the first in 2020, we didn't go to school from March on, and we had one positive case in the county that entire time, one in the whole county. So are we, you know,
We're overshooting this.
do we just, like you said, do we just relax and say, let's try it? We're in,
Like
We're in
Dale
small
said,
town USA
when
here,
we have
not in
20 cases
Minneapolis.
a week pop up in September, then, or November, or then we deal with it differently.
We see a dramatic rise.
Well, I think the key
From
to
last
it would
year?
be to find out some of those things that we're sort of unsure about is like the activities. If somebody were to test, you know, or you mean it, you know, is there going to be any difference that, are they going to be treated any differently? Like, because we're playing against other towns. I don't know, you know what I mean? Like before.
The number one thing we have to know is where our liability is. As
Right.
board members, we need to know what the liability is.
Right. If it's going to come back on us for relaxing it, if something were to happen.
So I guess to start with, we have to make sure that the recommendations are recommendations and not, you know, as board members, have to make sure that the school is not liable,
Right.
I know.
no matter which direction we go.
Liability in particular is that because language has been so difficult to interpret.
Mhm.
Some school districts are, you know, Alex going back to mass to under 12, and some school districts have absolutely no requirements. And then liability is simply an interpretation by
Of
the
the
board, the superintendent, and your legal counsel, and that's going to vary from school to school.
And then
So
if somebody decides to sue you for something or not, how that, and you know.
it's,
Need to
I mean,
We for sure need to hear that from our legal counsel, that it is just a matter of interpretation, and then that you go from there.
our legal counsel is paid to interpret. She's going to present her interpretation of what, just like if I was reading it, here's my interpretation. That's, our legal counsel
And
isn't,
anyone could be the same, different,
Right.
have a different,
Right.
different opinion.
Which is, but you still, as our responsibility as board members, is to make sure that that is the person that we hired to give us the interpretation, that is their interpretation. Because if their interpretation is you're gonna get sued and you're gonna lose, you probably should follow that.
I believe you already spoke with Christy Hastingsdale, didn't you?
Right. But that was
And then her
before
statement was, if there's a requirement, to follow that. If there's a recommendation, it would be difficult for anybody to trace a positive case back to exposure within the school system. I mean, that would be the challenge, to show that that's how it happened, because as I mentioned earlier, that Kayla contracts it, it's gonna be really difficult to prove that the only person you came in contact with that was positive besides, he's the only one. So that becomes a challenge, is that proof. But if Christy Hastings reviews this, she's gonna read the same words that we're reading. And right now, that last document that I found is a recommendation from CDC.
Then we're good.
Right.
We can do what we want.
And if,
MDH is definitely a recommendation.
Mhm.
So, I mean, and which trumps which? MDH, CDC, Horizon Public Health? They all have
CDC is telling
varying.
us to go with, to work
is
with
there one
MDH, and
that's-
MDH is saying recommendation.
The way I understand it is.
That threshold, you know,
is-
something,
The way I understand it is the CDC's authority is given to them by the federal government, and the federal government authority is based on state-to-state travel and international travel, not in-state. In-state is up to the states. And if they don't have anything, then it's local control, and it's up to us. We can do what we want.
there's, yeah, it's,
That's the way I understand how
where I see
it works.
have
I'm no lawyer.
obligation or a liability is, you know, if someone is it MDH that sets a quarantine time period when a positive test is reported? Who is it that sets who's the entity?
We have our decision tree comes from the Minnesota Department of Health. And that was last updated in May of this year. It hasn't been updated since.
So if a child were to test positive and we get communication from MDH requiring, or from the family that had
if you
received it
test
from
positive, you
MDH.
have to quarantine. I don't think we can get around that, right? That is a
But I
requirement.
think the policy becomes, if MDH has a required quarantine time period.
You have to
because
follow it.
Then we follow what MDH says. But beyond that, I think we've got some autonomy here to see what happens as we get into the beginning of the school year.
So when we look at quarantine, we look at line 1, which is accurate. The district will comply with quarantine timelines directed by medical providers. So if I'm told to stay home, we comply with that and we keep me out of school.
So we keep that and take everything
That
else out?
Then the rest would be the district will also comply with quarantine requirements mandated by MDH or CDC.
Mhm.
Because right now we see the words recommended.
Patient.
Mhm.
So basically, it's going to be a situation where if you test positive, you're going to be forced to quarantine. And then if they determine that maybe my brother, you know what I'm saying, is it, because then they would be the ones determining if somebody in my household had to quarantine, correct? Not us.
Right.
My doctor or whoever's telling me I have to quarantine because, right? Or
Yeah, the MDH, but the thing is the MDH takes like 4 days or more to call you to tell you who needs the quarantine. So you've already exposed everybody else around you.
oh,
Unless
Unless you've already
4
quarantined.
days might be a hurry.
Yes.
Could be, well, they were to the point where they said, we're not calling.
Yeah.
That's up to you to call. I mean, that's where they were last year. They said they're not calling. They're not tracing. We're leaving
But
it up
even
to the
like-
schools and the staff and
Yeah, the
things to do.
exposure that Damon had, we got a phone call like 5 days later.
oh, no, I'm saying like, so I'm saying when Damon tested positive, say Damon tested positive,
Like
what did they tell you then? That's my question. Did they tell you you had to quarantine your?
MDH didn't call me for how many days?
But when they did call
When
you,
they did-
what did they
when
communicate?
Damon tested positive, or what, didn't he test positive? Did you?
He did test positive, but the,
So they called you in
MDH
4 days, but what did they say in 4 days when they called you? What
Yeah.
did they tell you?
they had told him to quarantine then. And I quarantined him and the family,
But what, they just told you to quarantine him, not the family?
and the family.
And the-
Anybody who was in close contact with.
Is that different now than it was then, that you know about?
For a family member, it would be the same, I'm sure.
Family
So-
members the same.
Is the requirement that there's quarantine after a positive test until communication from MDH that will clarify what the expectation is beyond that? Right? Because we're talking about what happens in that gap from when someone tests positive to when MDH contacts the family. That would be where we would need to have, what's our protocol,
Seems
what's
like
our
there's a gap
process?
there. Shouldn't the doctor when the positive test happens, shouldn't that be? So when he tested positive, they didn't tell you right now you have to quarantine your
The
family,
lab called us, was it 24 hours later?
and they didn't tell, and they don't.
They had said, well, they called Dave, so.
And that's gonna
They
be,
just said that MDH would be contacting us and to continue quarantining.
So Chris, you had something to add regarding quarantine?
The second component when it comes to school, because when I put in what I knew, they would call me and ask if we were doing our contact tracing. And if I put yes, it went to a low priority.
Hmm.
That could be some other reason. It waited 4 days because if I was aware of it here, I assumed we did our contact tracing, which usually was already done before I was aware. So that could affect,
So if you said no, they may have done it faster.
because at the end, they were contacting me faster than I was getting it from the people in the individual buildings that were. So I don't know if that's a second component.
That's, I mean, the low risk and high risk is
Because I did put it as either high priority or low priority,
Mhm.
because they would call me and I would say whether or not we were doing tracing.
And you're saying if you said you were tracing, they would put you as low
Yeah,
all the time.
then I would click it as low in that meeting. But at the end, they would.
That's
call
probably
me before
why.
I got my
Mhm.
report in.
But no one told us that.
And at the end of the day, it goes back to personal responsibility pretty much. I mean, we had a staff member that got tested positive and we never got a call from Department of Health. They just told us, so then we followed the recommendations of, but nobody, as far as I know, maybe they called the city administrator or something, but as far as I know, we never got a phone call from the Department of Health that said your employee has tested positive. They just told us, and then when we went on with, what the recommendation were, and
So are we saying we would still notify people of a close contact? And then that would be the end of our,
Responsibility,
Well,
then it
that's what I'm
falls to
trying to
personal
understand. Yeah.
responsibility.
I think so. But we have a responsibility to report to the families and also to the state. But this paragraph right here again, so when we're looking at what CDC statement do we listen to? This one here uses the word should. And that's an April or an August 5th post. This is